Before Larian Studios made one of their most famous games, some of you might know, goes by the name of Baldur's Gate 3, they worked on their original IP known as Divinity. A franchise that's been with the studio since 2002, Larian has made multiple iterations of its property over the course of many years, starting with their first game, Divine Divinity. It had very similar gameplay to Diablo, where a top-down style action RPG system was utilized. Some nuances were present, but the core gameplay aspect was more or less the same.
They say there are only two ways of living for a poor girl.
I am strong, as a man should be. The strength of my body.
I'm a bad boy. I'm a bad boy.
Beyond Divinity, the sequel to Divine Divinity, had more or less the same gameplay style as the first, but with a second character to control.
Your fragile body has endured much pain, but you have shown great strength.
Lastly, Divinity 2, the sequel to Beyond Divinity, decided to go with a third-person action RPG instead of the Diablo-style gameplay. The game itself still has many of its former RPG mechanics, but with a bigger emphasis on third-person combat. There is also one other spin-off game known as Divinity Dragon Commander, which incorporated both RTS and turn-based strategy gameplay.
And there we have it, I suppose. The dragon son of a monarch deposed. Rightful heir to the throne.
While the games themselves were fun in their own right, they didn't quite have the same impact that Larian's next three games had made. In June of 2014, following their Kickstarter campaign, Divinity Original Sin was released for the PC and was well received by many. Much of the praise comes from the actual depth and complexity that the game offered in both its combat and RPG mechanics, which were reminiscent of traditional pen and paper style RPGs. The gameplay diverged greatly from Larian's previous attempts, opting for a slower pace, isometric perspective, coupled with a turn-based combat system. It was considered to be one of the most complete and densely created RPGs at the time. After Original Sin, Larian would go on to further hone their craft with their next two games, Divinity Original Sin 2 and Baldur's Gate 3. Divinity Original Sin 2 is actually a favorite of mine, and was my first entry into the Divinity series. Baldur's Gate 3 was my second game from Larian, and well, what can I say that hasn't already been said? The game is an amazing D&D RPG experience, and arguably the best I've had in any video game format. But, before these two games cemented their status as some of the best, Larian first had to figure out how to make their system work, and it's thanks to Divinity Original Sin 1 that all three games stand as the studio's crowning achievements and some of the best RPG experiences you could ask for. So with that said, Divinity Original Sin was released over 10 years ago, and much of its DNA is baked into the two games that followed it. Original Sin 2 is arguably the best incarnation of the Divinity franchise, and Baldur's Gate 3 is the pinnacle of 1 and 2's development, with the 5th edition D&D also baked in. Can the original game still have relevance even with Larian's current best out there right now? Well, let's find out.
Oh, what strange new world is this? Let us explore.
The game first introduces you to the character creation process. You get to choose your name, class, stats, talents, and of course, their looks. Your only choice of race is a human, but you still get a good number of classes to choose from. I would say that these classes encompass the quote-unquote core Divinity classes that comprise the Original Sins franchise. And, as typical of any RPG game, you get to make choices with regards to attributes, talents, and skills to customize and tailor your character however you want. An interesting aspect of Original Sin is that you actually get to play two characters simultaneously from the start, something that Larian has done before previously with Beyond Divinity. From a story perspective, you have the option to have the characters interact with each other in very interesting ways, letting them choose how they would react to different scenarios and different conversations. Although I personally would rather have two of my characters be on the same page, which is basically what I did in this playthrough, the idea of two characters being played pretty much sets up the game for cooperative play, which can also make for some unique dialogue if you and your buddy are not quite on the same page. Although only limited to 2 players, this was a nice addition and a good choice if you decide to go with multiplayer. The general flow of the game is basically you exploring the world, interacting with different characters, having combat encounters, and completing quests. Honestly, this kind of sounds like every other RPG experience, no? So what exactly is it that makes Divinity tick then? Well, it's the world, actually, and specifically your interaction with it. Larian's approach to level design is based on the player's freedom and interactivity. It's very much akin to putting a player in an open world sandbox game and letting them handle it however they want. Outside of some tidbits of tutorials to help you with specific game mechanics, the game more or less throws you into the world with little to no direction whatsoever. Everything you do, you sort of have to figure out for yourself. You're basically given the freedom to explore and handle it in your own way. I believe this is specifically to provide the player with a means of self-learning, in a way that rewards the player for their own initiative rather than being guided by the game. For me, the freedom to explore and unearth the game was one of the most enjoyable aspects of it, because it sort of felt like it was my own adventure to handle. There's an argument to be made that maybe this makes it harder for newer players to really get into the game. And yes, I think it can still be a little off-putting, because I too was a little overwhelmed when I first tried Original Sin 2. However, after I invested enough introductory time into experiencing what the game has to offer, I felt a sense of accomplishment and learning as I was able to discover things about the game that made it fun for me. It was that slight bit of push that I needed to keep going, and eventually, the game was pretty much normal to me. Talking about exploration, an additional design that further enhances this is how densely populated the levels are with different encounters. In both the original Sin games and Baldur's Gate 3, I always found myself saying that even though I've spent close to maybe 50 plus hours on the game, I'm still in just the very first act. This is because there are just so many things to do. It literally feels like Larian tried to stuff encounters and stories in every applicable nook and cranny of the world. There's just so much to explore and so much to look for. Although not quite as dense as Original Sin 2 and Baldur's Gate 3, I was happy to find that the design choice was still present here, and exploring never got boring for me. Your mileage may vary depending on how much of a completionist you are, but you'll at least have a multitude of things to do in Original Sin's world. The freedom to explore not only applies to the adventuring aspect, but the combat portion as well. It seems fairly simple from the outside looking in. You operate on a turn-based system, and, depending on your initiative and stats, you take turns whacking each other with your skills, magical spells, and even items. Combat is more or less straightforward. You just have to pick your targets and defeat them, right? What sets Original Sin's RPG combat apart from the rest is how the abilities affect each other as well as the environment. See, there was a moment, which also happened to me in Original Sin 2, that made me realize that casting and attacking was more than just simply selecting a target. The environment also reacts. Manage to poison an enemy? Well, now that poison pool can double as a bomb if you ignite it with fire. You used an ice spell? Well, now the floor is slippery and you can fall and be knocked prone. Oh, you're standing in a puddle of water? Well, let me just throw some lightning to oh shit, wait, that's my team. The environment itself is also a tool, and you can use it to your advantage however you want. The game's combat rewards creativity, and that for me is one of the best hallmarks of Larian's design. The game's difficulty can also be hard, especially when the AI finds its most optimal damage routes to kill you, so finding creative battle situations to turn the tide in your favor is very much how the game wants you to play. No honorable combat needed here. Do whatever it takes to survive and win the fight. Sure, there's some potential cheese to be had and there are builds that probably break the game, but that never stopped me from wanting to play my party the way I wanted. For me, it was using summons to bait my enemies, then following up with both close range and far range DPS to destroy them. Simple, but that's just only one of many ways you can go about with combat. In comparison to Original Sin 2, there's some minor differences in game mechanics as well as spell variety, but the overall combat system remains the same. A similar comparison to Baldur's Gate 3 as well, but that game has a more D&D 5th edition combat focus. In any case, Original Sin's combat still felt compelling enough to warrant creative use in spell variety and abilities, and it always felt rewarding when using them effectively. On the presentation side, the graphics are good for the 2014 era. The character models themselves don't feel too dated, and there's at least some nice silhouette distinctions with the different armor sets, but there's nothing really too jaw-dropping about them either. With regards to the monsters, a lot of them look very thematically appropriate. Skeletons look like skeletons, and some of the bigger monsters look very threatening. They do look a bit cartoony, but nothing too distracting. I think the strongest presentation points go to the environmental design. Divinity's world does feel really vibrant and colorful when it comes to some of the more natural looking areas. The more open environments look very lush and vibrant, with the green foliage contrasting their earthly surroundings. Other examples include cave systems that feel really dark and moody, while towns feel very lively and populated. While not trying to go for the most quote-unquote graphically realistic looking game, it feels wonderfully appropriate for the aesthetic that Larian was trying to go for. On the plus side, since this is a much older title, if you're looking for a similar but lighter version of Baldur's Gate 3 for example, that isn't taxing on your GPU, Original Sin might actually be a good starting point for you, even Original Sin 2. The sound design and music in this game are still pretty good. The classic instrumentals feel very appropriate for the world of Divinity, and the game is also really good about setting the mood for any situation, whether you're out exploring, spending time in town, or in the heat of combat. The sound effects are very nice too, and nothing feels out of place. Moving, swinging your sword, and casting a spell all feel very appropriate. With regards to the story, it's good at setting the overall premise and tone of Original Sin. You are a pair of source hunters, individuals who are sent to rid the world of magical users who utilize a dangerous magical power known as Source. You're here on an island to solve the mystery of a murder, which leads you to learn more about your past, the various characters that you meet, and more about Source itself. While the premise is interesting, it's not quite Original Sin's strongest aspect if I'm being honest, but it piqued my interest enough to want to learn more about my character's history. That being said though, while the story may not have warranted my full attention, the writing with regards to NPCs and their interactions was actually some of my favorite parts. The world building is one of the stronger points with the game's writing. You'll obviously come across the more serious and important bits throughout the main section of the story, but you'll also come across some interesting characters across the world. It was actually great to see some of Larian's humor in Original Sin, especially with the first character I came across when I landed on the beach.
Hear a shell's lament. Yield me unto the water.
Beyond this, there was still a whole cast of NPCs just waiting for me to meet them. For me, it's that bit of world building that makes it so much more fun to want to explore and talk to different characters, giving life to Divinity's world and making NPCs have personality. I do think Original Sin 2 and Baldur's Gate 3 definitely have the stronger writing points, but that's sort of to be expected since they are this game's successors. Still, the charm of the NPCs were there for me, and I loved every bit of it. Oh, and make sure to pick Pet Pal so you can talk to the animals. They're every bit as fun to talk to in this game. So after finally jumping into Original Sin and seeing the basis of what made Original Sin 2 and Baldur's Gate 3 so great, it was still a very fun experience. It may not quite have the same polish that its successors have, but it's still a fun gem of a game nonetheless. Diving into the world and being able to explore every nook and cranny is still some of the best fun to have. Not to mention coming across NPCs with many different personalities that liven up the setting. In combat, outfitting my group and trying to figure out what classes and spells worked best for me was a lot of fun, and it still had a lot of depth and complexity despite being a predecessor. I think the only major gripes that I have are some of the quality of life issues in the original classic game. Mostly stuff like attacks not connecting, targeting, or the camera not going a full 360. These gripes, however, are actually fixed in the enhanced version of the game, along with a multitude of other things, including spell balance changes, fully voice lines for characters, better optimized graphics, and some major additions to the story.
Look! Look! A wanderer comes my way.
I'm not too familiar with the complete changes, but you can find them online with all the details. The enhanced version is actually why I'm holding off on finishing the game, because I want to restart and continue my playthrough with that version. I'm actually kind of looking forward to seeing the full voice lines, especially from what I saw in an early look.
We can't well turn away from such an odious show of Source. Let's investigate the tomb and see what answers it might reveal.
That being said, my overall experience with the classic was still fun nonetheless, and it helped me realize how much Larian had established a very good basis for their design approach to their later games. While Original Sin's design is a bit on the older side by comparison, I'd say it still holds up very well, and it honestly is worth your time if you're looking for a good classical style RPG with a very good turn-based combat. But if I had to recommend a specific version for everyone, I think the enhanced version would be the way to go, as the quality of life changes make the game feel so much better for an up-to-date playthrough. You're more than welcome to give Classic a try though, and you also get a copy of it if you buy the enhanced version through Steam, so that's a nice package deal. But that's gonna do it for today's video guys, and thanks for stopping by. I had a lot of fun finally visiting Original Sin, and it was nice to be able to play a classical style RPG again. I think for the next video, I'm gonna revisit a much older, but favorite game to see whether or not that one has stood the test of time. But yeah, thanks for coming everyone, and I'll see you all next time.